Welcome to 'Cause We're Nerds, the podcast that covers trends and new releases in comics, movies, video games, board games, and much more. I'm your host, Zach, and with me is my co-host and cousin, Caleb.
Hey everybody.
Thanks for joining us in our current series, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, where we will be discussing each MCU movie in release order, all leading up to Marvel's Avengers Infinity War this May. We have finally reached the culmination of Phase 1 in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, with 5 movies all leading to The Avengers. How did this unprecedented movie set a standard for bringing together a major cast of superheroes? Who is the strongest and the weakest Avenger in this movie? And why didn't Edward Norton come back to reprise his role as the Hulk? Find out these answers and much more on 'Cause We're Nerds, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, The Avengers. Scarlett Johansson, Chris Evans, Robert Downey Jr., Chris Hemsworth, Jeremy Renner, Tom Hiddleston, Mark Ruffalo, Samuel L. Jackson, Gwyneth Paltrow, and Colby Smulders. Caleb, that's a huge casting list. Are you ready for this?
Born ready.
Well, not as ready for me. I have my Avengers drinking glass that I've been using every podcast since we started that has the Hulk, Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor in it, and I am ready to sip away.
Well, as you can see, I'm sitting in my man/nerd cave, which is completely decked out in Avengers stuff. I've got Avengers rug over there. I've got Avengers picture over there. I've got Thor figures. I've got Spider-Man figures. I feel like I've got you beat on this one.
You nerd.
Aren't we all? Man, I mean, it's a good time to be a nerd. I mean, we're talking about the Avengers on screen.
That's right, the Avengers. So, Caleb, why did Kevin Feige decide on these superheroes for the Avengers movie?
Well, as you mentioned in some of our earlier podcasts, Zach, these were really the original lineup of Avengers that were published way back in the 60s. So when you're bringing them to the screen, why not do the originals?
Yeah, I agree with that. Are you familiar with the original Avengers team?
The team itself or the characters or the comics? What specifically?
I guess all of it.
So I am familiar with the characters, especially at the point that this came out. As I mentioned in our previous podcast, I've been reading comics for several years at that point. There had been many TV shows. I'm not sure if Earth's Mightiest Heroes was on air at that point, but that was a big show that I was into. The comics, not quite as much. I would read the crossovers, but they weren't strictly Avengers titles. The Avengers were always in them. And especially the classic versions, I've never read anything Avengers related prior to maybe 2000 or so.
Yeah, I knew of the Avengers. I grew up reading those comics. The run I guess I'm most familiar with is the New Avengers that had Spider-Man and Wolverine and other characters on it. It was a great run. But as far as the original Avengers, I actually have the Avengers issue number 6 that's all stored away in my comic collection. Yeah. But issue number 1 was actually created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby in 1963 with a cast of pre-existing superheroes. So for the plot of the first comic, it was actually kind of like the plot of this movie we're going to dive into. Because Loki comes to Earth seeking revenge for his brother Thor, and Rick Jones, who is like the buddy of the Hulk, decides to bring together these superheroes who had already been established in the Marvel comic universe. So you had Ant-Man, the Wasp, Iron Man, Thor, and Hulk. And in that comic, Loki actually manipulates Hulk, kind of like he does in this movie. And so that's the cast that brings together. Interestingly enough, in the second comic, Ant-Man actually changes his name to Giant Man, and the Hulk leaves the group. And we actually don't even see Captain America until Avengers number 4, and Hawkeye and Black Widow don't join until much later on.
Now, isn't Captain America on the cover of the first issue?
Nope.
Oh, really? I thought he was. I thought it was that one where it's him, he's kind of bending forward, and then everyone's around him.
Well, that's a great question, and many people actually think that's Avengers number 1. But if you go ahead and Google that image, that is Avengers number 4 that has Captain America leaning over. You have Iron Man, and his actual I can't remember which Mark this is, but it's a newer setting, and he's jumping up, and then you see kind of Giant Man in the background. If you go to Avengers, the first comic, #1, you still see Iron Man in his old armor. Now, granted, it's not silver, but it's still this yellowish gold look.
Okay, well, my bad.
The Avengers movie that we get now takes some inspiration from what I just mentioned, but I think it takes more inspiration from the Avengers, The Ultimates. Are you familiar with that comic run at all?
You know, Marvel launched an app several years ago, and they had a bunch of free comics on it. And I downloaded Ultimates #1, and I read, I don't think I got to the end of it. I read about half of it or so, and it was really good. And I totally meant to go back and finish it, but I never got a chance. So I'm familiar with that idea. I have seen the animated versions that they did in the early to mid 2000s. If that's anything like the comics, then yes.
Yeah, I think it's close enough. The Ultimate Comics actually kind of went the route of modernizing the superheroes. So, for example, Hawkeye in his original form donned these bright purple clothing, and in the Avengers movie, we see that he doesn't. Well, that's taken actually directly from the Ultimates. In the Ultimate version of Hawkeye, he's wearing this kind of black garb like he is in the movie. He has those goggles, and he doesn't have this bright purple costume. Not only that, but one of the artists for the Ultimates, Brian Hitch, was, I don't think, credited in the movie itself, but was credited on set. Whereas the director, Joss Whedon, would usually state, oh, that looks like a Brian Hitch shot. Meaning he was recalling to the shot looks so perfect that it looks like Brian Hitch's artwork on the Ultimate Comics.
That's really cool. And I think it's kind of funny you mentioned that he wears these goggles in the comics. I remember the lead up to this movie, a lot of the posters had Hawkeye wearing these glasses, and we have never seen them in any of the movies while he's wearing his costume.
And thankfully, not. And so for the Avengers movie, Caleb, we get Joss Whedon. Were you familiar with this director going into the Avengers movie, either, well, the first time you watched this movie or even now?
I was not very familiar with him, no. Of course, coming into this movie, he got a lot of press. Everybody was talking about him. So I knew that the big thing he had done was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. He did later do Firefly, which I have seen some of since. I also have seen Buffy some since. My wife shotgunned the entire thing on Netflix, and I thought it was near unwatchable.
Yeah, I've never seen Buffy, and I have no intention to ever see that. However, I had watched Firefly, and so I knew of Joss Whedon going into the Avengers film, and I was pretty excited to see him directing this movie.
Yeah, I know that everybody said he was a great choice because he can do group shows and group movies. And you have that a lot when you have people coming from television. Because in television, typically, you have a large cast of characters that have to be shuffled around and have to be managed in a way that makes sense. So it does make sense to pull someone from that world to come in and do this movie instead of taking people that are more used to doing films about a single person or maybe two people and make that work.
Now, not only do we get Joss Whedon here to direct, but back to pin our story is Zach Penn, who you might recall wrote the script for The Incredible Hulk back in 2008.
Yeah, so Penn wrote the script, but according to all of my research, when Joss came in, he looked at it and said, I don't like this at all. In fact, there was a quote, I don't have it written down, but it was something to the effect of, we should pretend that this script never happened. And Joss completely rewrote the whole thing.
So we don't know how much of the original script he kept, or did he simply scratch everything?
From what I know, he scrapped everything, but there could be moments from that original script that he did keep in there.
Poor Zach. That's the second time he's tried to write a Marvel movie only to be rewritten by somebody on set. And Caleb, that's really interesting because if you watch the credits after this movie, Zach Penn gets the writing the script credit for this movie.
That's interesting. Maybe some of his ideas did pull over. I think that from the reading I got the sense that his script wasn't as tight. It didn't flow as well as Joss's does. And let me tell you, this movie is a well-oiled machine. I did not realize until I was writing down notes for this recording, but it is very tight. So I wouldn't be surprised if those elements showed up from his original script, even though it's in a different form.
As we mentioned in an earlier podcast, after the success of Iron Man, Kevin Feige decided to cast this vision for the Avengers. And so 5 movies later, here we have a bunch of pre-existing superheroes. In fact, the majority of the characters in the Avengers movie have already been introduced in one fashion or another. However, the one major change we get is that we have a significant character switch in Bruce Banner.
That's right. We have Mark Ruffalo instead of Edward Norton this time. Did you know him when this movie came out?
I did not. I heard some of the rumors that Edward Norton was backing off and that Ruffalo would be cast instead, and I had no idea who this actor was. Did you?
I had absolutely no idea who this actor was, and I've seen him in a couple of things since, but still, I haven't seen a lot of his work, and looking at it, man, he's been around for a very, very long time. This wasn't like his break in Hollywood. It might have been his biggest break, but he's been around and he's been working for quite a while, so I was surprised I hadn't heard of him.
Now, I do remember that when rumors first came out, the rumors that I was reading or hearing was that Marvel simply didn't offer Edward Norton enough money to come back and be recast as Bruce Banner in this film. However, if you do a little more research, that simply is not true. Or is it?
Well, in my research, I mean, the rumors say everything, right? It can be anything from creative differences to money to they were both jerks. But the only solid thing that I could find was Marvel released a statement when they announced that Mark Ruffalo would be replacing him in 2010, which pretty much said something to the effect of, we need someone that can work with a team, someone that's a team player, which seems to suggest that Edward Norton wasn't working well with the other group, which does play into what we talked about in the Incredible Hulk podcast about him being in control and needing that script control.
And right after Marvel released their statement, Norton actually released his own statement, which basically stated that their talks were going well, that Kevin Feige brought him in, that Joss talked to Norton, and the discussions were going great. They moved on to salary negotiation, and then just all of a sudden, Marvel basically stopped contacting him and dropped him like an ex-girlfriend and just didn't talk to Norton at all. And so which side you believe, Marvel or Norton, it's pretty hard to tell. Obviously, I would say there's truth in both of their statements, but both of their statements also are very one-sided. What we do get is in 2010, Norton actually posted on Facebook that he really wanted it to work, that it simply didn't, so kind of reaffirming what the statement he stated. But a little later on, I believe it was after Age of Ultron, Norton kind of came back and basically stated that he chose not to be a part of the superhero franchise because he wanted more diversity. So again, whether Norton's trying to save face, we really can't tell, but what we do know is that Norton is hard to work with others. We covered that in The Incredible Hulk, and I would say that's kind of the motivating factor of deciding not to bring Norton back and instead recasting Mark Ruffalo in that role.
And I think that they were also going in a different direction for the character. We'll talk about it more when we see him on screen in this film, but the way that Ruffalo plays it is very different than the way that Norton did.
Now, another new add-on in this movie is Maria Hill, played by Colby Smulders. Caleb, were you familiar with this actor, or even this character?
I was familiar with Colby Smulders because she was on How I Met Your Mother, which was a very big show at the time, and my wife was a very big fan, so I knew who she was. As terms of the character, I think I had seen her in some comics. A lot of the comics I was reading at that time were the Ultimate line of comics, specifically Ultimate Spider-Man. And so she would show up time to time. So I think I'd seen her, but I didn't know a whole lot about her. How about yourself?
Well, like your wife, I was familiar with Colby Smulders playing this role because I had seen a lot of her in How I Met Your Mother. What's interesting is that she plays a very different character in How I Met Your Mother versus the Avengers movie. On the other hand, I was also familiar with Maria Hill due to the comic run of Civil War. In Civil War, Maria Hill kind of takes over for Nick Fury. She's the director of S.H.I.E.L.D., and she's the one that tries to detain Captain America in that storyline. Obviously, we'll have to talk more about that when we get to the Civil War movie, but I was familiar with her going into the Avengers movie.
And with that comic book storyline, there were a lot of writers that had to kind of collaborate to make sure that everything fell in place. Similarly, Joss Whedon had to work with the other directors to make sure that all the characters were in the right places for this movie. When he signed on, he got a rewrite of Captain America, the First Avenger. Not so much story stuff, but just adding little flakes of details here and there to make sure that everything he was doing in the First Avenger was jiving with the stuff he was doing in the Avengers, and that it's the same character throughout.
Well, Caleb, what Joss Whedon was able to do for the Avengers, Rian Johnson was unable to do for Star Wars Episode 8. But I digress. That is another conversation for another time. So for now, why don't you dive into the synopsis for the Avengers?
When Thor's evil brother Loki, played by Tom Hiddleston, gains access to the unlimited power of the energy cube called the Tesseract, Nick Fury, played by Samuel L. Jackson, director of S.H.I.E.L.D., initiates a superhero recruitment effort to defeat the unprecedented threat to Earth. Joining Fury's dream team are Iron Man, played by Robert Downey Jr., Captain America, played by Chris Evans, the Hulk, played by Mark Ruffalo, Thor, played by Chris Hemsworth, the Black Widow, played by Scarlett Johansson, and Hawkeye, played by Jeremy Renner.
So Caleb, when this movie opens, I'm assuming that Loki, since Thor, has just been falling through the black hole, hitting comets, hitting planets, just bouncing off of kind of objects. And then he lands right in front of this Chitauri commander who gives him a stick and basically states, go take over Earth, correct?
Well, it's basically cosmic pinball, right?
But it brings up a question. How on earth did Loki get here?
Well, I don't think it's really that important how he got here. There were a lot of interviews at the time that talked about this, and what Kevin Feige said is that he's gone through the black hole, he ends up somewhere else, right? It doesn't really matter. But he's gone around the galaxy, he's gone around the universe, and he's made some shady deals with people. We'll find out who those people are at the end of the film, but he's learned a lot more than he knew when he was on Asgard.
Now, not only do we see Loki talking to the Chitauri commander, and does this commander have a name?
Yeah, and I don't think it's mentioned in the film, but in the credits and everybody that talks about it, he is called The Other. The Other. Very ominous, very mysterious, until he is proven not to have a ton of power in a later movie. And you know, I noticed in this showing, he's got 2 thumbs. Did you notice that? On both hands. He's got 4 total thumbs. That's a lot of thumbs, man. It seems like such an odd thing to add a detail over. Like, his face is so interesting. Why are we looking at his hands? But yeah, he's got 2 thumbs. Very strange. Probably was a Zach Penwright classic. So not only do we see Loki interacting with this other, but we also see that he has a new powerful staff. So, Caleb, how is this staff powered? Because what I recalled from the Avengers was that the staff had a piece of the Tesseract in it. But looking back, that can't be possible because the Tesseract is on Earth. So which is it? I think your confusion comes from the fact that the thing that's powering the staff looks the same as the Tesseract. We had this issue in a previous film where things looked the same. And I think it's just movies at the time, right? They liked to have giant blue glowy things. Sometimes it was a beam flying into the sky. Sometimes it's a magical object. But it was a very popular thing when this movie came out. The thing that's actually powering the staff is that stone, that orb that's lodged into the top of it that, again, looks like the Tesseract. You're actually completely wrong, Caleb. That was a trick question. You failed the exam. F-. What? So later on in this movie, on the helicarrier, we find out, I believe it's Thor who mentions, that the staff itself is powered by the Tesseract. So I'm assuming this would have had to taken place before the Tesseract fell to Earth. I don't remember that line. I'd be interested to go back and see that. But to me, that doesn't make sense with what we see in this movie, and it surely does not make sense with what we see in some later films. The other thing that's kind of new in this opening is that the other specifically says the Tesseract has awakened. And I thought that phrase kind of holds some meaning. As we will find out in some later movies, I'm going to go ahead and spoil it now, the Tesseract is an Infinity Stone. I think we've already mentioned that in one of the other podcasts, but there are basically 6 Infinity Stones, right, Zach? There's 6?
That's correct, yep.
Okay, so they're scattered all throughout the universe, and this leads me to believe that they can go dormant, they can lose their power, or what does that mean?
Yeah, Caleb, I'm not really sure what that means. I assume that you're correct. They can go dormant, they can hibernate, and they can maybe awaken once they are called by another powerful being. I don't think it really makes much sense, but I don't think it really has to make much sense.
Well, I think it could open up some plot holes because, like, it seems to be working between the events of Captain America and this film, because we see in the after the credit scene in Thor that Nick Fury has it, and it seems to be in this box that's kind of containing its power, and Howard Stark was also using it in Captain America, and it still had power. So it's weird that it awakened. And the other strange thing is we'll see in the next scene, they're able to use it to transport somewhere without being with it, which is something that I think, again, does not jive with later movies.
No, it doesn't. Now, in this opening scene, not only do we get Loki and the Tesseract, but we also get a quick identification of the enemy, the Chitauri.
That's right, this massive horde of aliens. We don't get a good look at them here, but we will see them later on for sure.
I don't know if you remember this, Caleb, but when this movie was in production, I know a lot of people were speculating that the enemy would be the Skrulls.
I do remember that, and there was a lot of questions about that because didn't Fox own Fantastic Four, and don't they own the Skrulls? And it was eventually revealed that these were the Chitauri, and people were like, oh, that's a disappointment, because the Chitauri are an alien race from that Ultimate line of comic books. Now, the ones here look nothing like the ones from the comic books, and they actually have very little to do with either the comic book version or the Skrulls.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, there are kind of 2 versions of the Chitauri, and again, it depends on the version of Avengers and the comic run that you're reading. So on one hand, as you already mentioned, Caleb, there's an ultimate version, and they are actually kind of like Skrulls. They can shapeshift into any race, and they're later defeated by the Avengers in kind of the same setup that we see in the Avengers movie. Again, recalling the fingerprints of Brian Hitch and others in this MCU universe. Well, that's kind of redundant, but in the MCU. Now, the other version of the Chitauri is found on Earth 616, which is kind of the regular Avengers. And here, they're more like insects than like Skrulls who follow a queen. I think in the movie, we actually get a combination. They're not necessarily like Skrulls, but they are kind of their own being, right? On the other hand, however, and we'll talk about this later on, they kind of have a home base, and when they get defeated, they all kind of die like insects because they lost their queen. And so I think this enemy that we get is a combination of those 2 ideas.
It definitely is, and I want to just kind of mention this real quick. I think the Chitauri, when they were introduced in the Ultimate Comics, were basically that universe's version of the Skrulls. And the Chitauri that you're talking about in the 616 universe, which is the regular Marvel universe, those were introduced after the ones in the Ultimate Universe as a way to bring them in, which they do a lot in the comics.
So after this quick opening that sets kind of the stage for us needing these heroes, we then jump to the S.H.I.E.L.D. base, where we get a couple first appearances. Well, I wouldn't say a first appearance, but we haven't seen Hawkeye since Thor.
In Thor, we saw this guy for all of, maybe 30 seconds if you cut all of his footage together. But here, he's a main character. What did you think of Jeremy Renner in this role?
You know, I thought he was really good. I had no idea who this actor was, and I know we haven't really talked about his casting in Thor, but obviously he was cast in both Thor with the idea that he would play Hawkeye in the Avengers.
This guy, when he was in Thor, was big because of the movie called The Hurt Locker. And I believe, Zach, if you remember, we actually watched that film together.
Yeah, it's a great movie, and I do remember watching it with you. Yeah.
Yeah, and he won a lot of awards for that. He got a lot of acclaim, and that's what actually got him the casting for Thor and the Avengers. Aside from him, we also are introduced to Maria Hill here, again played by Colby Smulders.
That's right, and a bunch of returning characters. We have Nick Fury, Dr. Solveig, and Agent Coulson.
And before we get too far, I do want to note that there's actually an alternate opening for this film that takes place before the S.H.I.E.L.D. base. So I'm not sure if we still would have gotten the opening with the Tesseract and the other. I think we would, but immediately after that, it cuts to Maria Hill, and she's sitting talking to the World Security Council, which we'll get to in a moment. But basically, it's after the events of this movie have happened. She's giving a report, and the entire film would have been a flashback. Also, in that opening, it foreshadows a ton of stuff in this film. There are some really cool shots that aren't in the film itself, but are during the events of the film. So, for example, there's Thor holding his hammer with blood falling off of it, which is supposed to be when he's fighting the Hulk. There's the shot of Iron Man's faceplate hitting the ground, which is towards the end of the movie. And it's got this very dour tone. And I think that they thought maybe it was a little bit too dour. And also, she kind of was throwing some shade on Nick Fury, which is another thing they cut. But that originally led directly into the S.H.I.E.L.D. base, which gave us an idea of who she was in the context of S.H.I.E.L.D.
Caleb, it's important you bring that up about this tone because this movie, while yes, it's a legit movie, also has a lot of comical features and has a lot of features pointed towards children. And I think that's something to keep in mind as we're watching these films, is that Marvel is now owned by Disney, and what sells? Well, a movie with superheroes for kids and a movie that sells merchandise. And movies like this and like the new Star Wars films, while yes, they're for a wide audience, they're also meant for children to be able to watch and enjoy. And I think this movie has some of that with the lighter tones and with some of the humor, kind of slapstick humor that it has ingrained in the movie.
That's true, although I also think that this film has a very distinctly Joss Whedon tone. And we talked about his works on those other TV shows. Fans love him because of the way that he specifically handles things, the way that he talks about things, the way he frames things. And I think that plays into this a lot, as well as the fact that it's very similar to the Avengers comics.
So after meeting these new characters and reoccurring characters, we see that the Tesseract has been acting up, and a funny line dropped by Dr. Solveig when he's like, oh, it's just emitting gamma radiation, low levels, it's nothing to worry about. And Nick Fury looks at him with his one good eye and is like, oh, you need to worry about that.
Yeah, gamma radiation can be dangerous.
Exactly. And pretty soon, poof, out of thin air, Loki appears because it's a doorway. Now, we mentioned this in our opening that doesn't really work because he doesn't have the Tesseract, so I'm not really sure how we can activate it. But nonetheless, he's here in front of us.
And immediately, we notice this is a very different Loki than we got in Thor. I remember when I saw this, I was shocked because he comes in, he's sweaty, his hair is longer, which I just want to say, with each movie, both Thor and Loki's hair seems to get longer.
True.
Which is funny. But he comes in, he's got the spear. We see apparently he's bulletproof, which I didn't know, and he kills a lot of guys very viciously.
Is he bulletproof, or are the bullets simply bouncing off his armor?
I think that he's bulletproof because they hit him like in his chest area, and while he might have some armor under there, I'm pretty sure most of that's leather.
Well, it's probably because he's holding his staff and that's somehow powering him up, because I believe in later films he can get hurt and he's not bulletproof.
Well, the powers of the Asgardians I always find a bit strange in this movie and the Marvel Cinematic Universe. As we'll see later, Thor gets stabbed at one point very easily, and I don't really know how that happened because I thought they were tougher than that, but it is a bit ambiguous.
So Loki goes to town and starts murdering a bunch of S.H.I.E.L.D. agents. I don't know about you, Caleb, but for me, this isn't the Loki we saw in Thor. The Loki we saw in Thor was a very different character. Yes, he had a tint towards not making the correct choices, but he still had a reason behind it. He still wasn't this super evil person that just started murdering individuals. However, when we jump to the Avengers movie, he starts taking out people left and right and murdering. And later on in the movie, we see that his head count's 82 people in 2 days.
I completely go for this. I think that this is great. It makes sense to me because when he falls down that black hole at the end of Thor, he has been dejected. He's been dejected his entire life. He's always been in the shadow of Thor, but he's trying to prove to his father that he can be a king and that he's a worthy heir. After that movie, there's no way that that's going to happen again. He goes through the black hole. He is super desperate. At this point, all he's wanting is to figure stuff out for himself. So he goes off, like I mentioned, and he meets people and he learns things. And he develops as a character. And those emotions, if you let them build, this is true for anyone, not just Loki or a fictional character. If you harbor those dark emotions and you dwell on them, you do start to become a very, very dark person. And that's what's happened to him here.
Well, he's very dark in that he decides to destroy a lot of the S.H.I.E.L.D. compound just simply by coming to Earth and activating the Tesseract. And we also see him take over not only Hawkeye, but also Dr. Solvig and escape. We also see a couple cool scenes with Maria Hill and Nick Fury doing their best, and they do okay.
Yeah, we get a pretty good chase scene here. And this is something that we hadn't seen in the Marvel Universe very much, is a strong female character. We had Black Widow and Iron Man 2, but Maria Hill here is number 2 on S.H.I.E.L.D's payroll. And she's the S.H.I.E.L.D. is this massive, powerful thing. And she gets a lot of screen time here. And I think she does a phenomenal job.
And not only is Maria Hill look amazing, but I believe that Black Widow even looks better in this movie. And so after that scene, we jump to the scene where we see Black Widow, who is the first Avenger other than Hawkeye who is introduced in this movie. And then it starts a sequence of events where we start jumping to the other Avengers as they are introduced. All starting with Black Widow, who is in Russia.
And I think Marvel has a thing for Russia and for Germany, because this is the second or third time we've been there in a Marvel movie at this point. But she's there with a couple of people, they're interrogating her, and the point of this scene really is to say, hi, I'm Black Widow, I'm part of S.H.I.E.L.D., and to show us how awesome she is. She has another action scene similar to the one that we got in Iron Man 2, but man, there's a lot of hair whipping.
Okay, that's funny that you mentioned that Marvel has a love fest with Russia, because actually it's Joss Whedon who has a love fest with Russia. This is the scene that is the only scene that appears exactly as it was written in Joss's first draft of the script. So he came back, he rewrote the script, and then obviously it morphed and it's changed as the script kind of went on, but this scene stayed the same. The reason behind that was because Joss Whedon studied both Russian language and Russian literature in college, and so that's why we get I believe the subtitles instead of them speaking in a Russian accent in English, and it's also why this is taking place in Russian, was never cut. Joss Whedon likes this era, likes what he sees, and so it happens. Now, not only do we get that, but I think we get the best scene for Black Widow that we've seen to date. We see her take down a bunch of people in a superb way, what I think is better than what she did in Iron Man 2, and I think this is the best Black Widow scene in the entire Avengers movie.
I kind of have to disagree with you there. I think that what she did in Iron Man 2 was more interesting. She did stuff that you just don't see people do all the time. In this scene, while she did take out the guys, the really only interesting thing that I hadn't really seen before was her flipping the chair, right? But everything else was pretty, brawly, down in the dirt. It didn't feel like a S.H.I.E.L.D. operative. So for me personally, I prefer the fight in Iron Man 2.
Well, and it's here where she gets a call from Agent Coulson, who gets her into the fray and kind of gets her on this track to join the Avengers because Agent Barton has been compromised. Now, do you know a lot of their backstory?
I know that they were very tight agents in the comics that looked out for each other and did a lot together, but that's about the extent of it.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I think it depends on the comic you read and the relationship, but I didn't know a lot of their pre-existing friendship or pre-existing relationship, and I think this movie does an okay job expanding on that.
So after she breaks out and she gets a call from Coulson, we find out that she's being sent to Calcutta to talk to the big guy.
And right before she leaves, in Russian, she states, Bazi moi. Now, I probably just butchered that, but basically it's Russian for, oh my god.
I kind of wondered if it was that or something a bit more explicit.
She is terrified to go after the Hulk.
Yeah, we see a lot in this movie that she is scared of the Hulk. We see it here a little bit. There's some scenes later on that she has with the Hulk when he's first transforming. And the level of fear that she expresses about it is palpable, right? I mean, we got scenes in some of the other movies about the fear surrounding the Hulk. But I think that this film by far outsells anything that they had done with that idea in the previous films.
We jump to Calcutta, and it's here where we get the first appearance of Mark Ruffalo as Bruce Banner. Off the bat, Caleb, great acting by Mark Ruffalo in this movie and in this scene.
Yeah, it took me a while to figure out what I thought about him as a character because I really liked the Norton version at the time. Now, I am totally on board with Ruffalo. I think that he has the far superior version of Bruce Banner.
Yeah, the first time I watched the Avengers movie, I'm with you, Caleb. I didn't know what to think. Hindsight 2020, now after seeing him act in a bunch of other movies in the MCU, I think that this was a great casting choice by Kevin Feige. What do you think of this Bruce Banner versus the Bruce Banner we got back in 2008?
Well, it's funny, you actually say cast by Kevin Feige. This guy was cast by Joss Whedon. It was his first choice. He said he had a very short list, and at the very top was Mark Ruffalo. And I think that he's more interesting than the Norton version. Even when he's not doing anything, he just seems to have this air about him that he knows what he's doing, that he's very intelligent. He's very much more timid. He does seem smarter. And I think that plays more into the version of Banner that's in the comics than the version that we got in The Incredible Hulk. What's your take?
Yeah, I think that was actually retconned for this new version of Bruce Banner they have in the Avengers. He's kind of retconned in two ways that I could tell. The first, as you mentioned, Caleb, is that this Bruce Banner is smart. Like in the comics, he obviously is probably one of the smartest people on Earth, or the top 5 smartest people in Earth, like he is in the comics. And you can tell that through a lot of his interactions he has. And just in this opening scene, we know that he knows a lot about gamma radiation, and he's a doctor, which is very different than in the 2008 film, where he was sort of smart, but wasn't like this genius at all. The second thing they retconned, or it could be a continuation from The Incredible Hulk, is that this Bruce Banner is in control of the Hulk. In fact, in this scene, there's a funny joke that the Black Widow states that Bruce Banner must be doing yoga, which, if you remember The Incredible Hulk, is a callback to that end scene.
Yeah, and that's a reveal that he can control it that we don't get until much, much later into the film. But I do agree. I don't know if he's in complete control of it. I think he's kind of like aiming it. They use that line in The Incredible Hulk, maybe I can aim it. I think that's what he's doing here. Maybe a little bit more than aiming, but you're right. He does have more of that ability to choose what he does. Now, there's a thing that I wanted to talk about here, when he's talking to Black Widow. There's a scene, there's a line where he says something to the effect of, we don't always get what we want. And when he does that, he looks at this baby rocker and he rocks it back and forth. And I've never really noticed this before, but you get this real sense of longing and despair from him in that moment, because I think what that's meant to tell us is because of this curse that he's been given, the gamma radiation and the Hulk, he can't have a family. He can't settle down. He can't be in love. And that's something that they kind of follow up with in Avengers Age of Ultron.
And this was actually an ad-lib by Mark Ruffalo. Joss Whedon states that that line was in the script, but it's when they actually went onto location when they were in this room that they noticed the crib that was splattered with green paint, and Mark Ruffalo just ad-libbed that part, and it worked really well. What I also love about this setting, and props to the set design team, is that this location was all splattered with green paint. And so subliminally, you're thinking about the Hulk.
I didn't even notice that. Is it like very bright paint? Can you actually see it in the scene?
No, it's not bright paint due to the fact that the set is dark itself, but I noticed it right away. If you went back and you just looked at the background instead of Black Widow or Bruce Banner, you would see the green paint somewhere in the room.
Okay. Well, following that scene, we jump to Nick Fury, and he's talking to a big part of this film, the World Security Council. Zach, who are these guys?
Caleb, I have no idea. Who are these guys?
Well, I get the take that it's sort of like the United Nations, right? It's a group of people that make up this board that is over S.H.I.E.L.D. because we've talked about before, we don't really know how S.H.I.E.L.D. is organized. And this film starts to kind of have a solid base for what they are. And they're an independent international organization, really. They're primarily based in the United States, but they go all over the world. And so I think this is the overseeing board that Nick Fury has to report to. They're basically his bosses, but they're collectively his bosses, not any one of them.
This is the part I've always hated about the Avengers. I'm not really sure why S.H.I.E.L.D. needs to report to some board council that's in charge of the Earth. It sounds like the Illuminati to me. I also don't, it doesn't really make sense that somebody in Germany and the Mideast and Asia can determine, hey, let's just nuke New York City. That sounds like a good plan. And so this didn't really pay off. I do know that the Security Council does make an appearance in the comics. Maria Hill actually establishes them. Once she becomes the S.H.I.E.L.D. director, in her second tenure, she establishes the Security Council as a means of telling her what to do. And so she isn't just telling everybody else, but she has some type of security blanket there to catch her to make sure she isn't just making a ton of decisions.
And it doesn't pay off here very much, but they do come back in some other materials. They play a part in the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. in a season or two, and they also play a much bigger role in Captain America Winter Soldier.
But as Nick Fury states, a war isn't won by a council, it is won by soldiers. And here we next go to Captain America. And for a second, I just want to say that the transitions up to this point in the movie have been spectacular. And they continue to be spectacular. We get what I just mentioned, it's won by soldiers, Captain America. We have Natasha Romanoff going after the Hulk, and then we're in Calcutta, India, going after the Hulk. We see Captain America and Nick Fury will talk, and Captain America states that the Tesseract should have been left in the ocean. And the next scene is we get Tony Stark in the ocean. So we get a lot of these great transitions in this movie.
And I think a lot of that, again, is Joss Whedon's writing and his sensibility for editing and keeping things brisk. Now, when Fury comes into Captain America's area, I kind of have some questions about this. What has Captain America, Steve Rogers, been doing since he's been thawed out of the ice?
Have you seen his body? He's just been working out. That's it, 24/7.
Yeah, well, he doesn't look any worse than he did in the last film, that's
True.
for sure. But we don't get a sense of how long it's been since he's been thawed out. And we'll see a little bit later, he has not been out as Captain America. So what's he been doing?
I don't think he's been doing much. I think you can just assume as a viewer that he's trying to find his place in the world. And he's back at a gym that he feels comfortable in Brooklyn. And I really like this brief recap of Cap that we get. And it's just like 5 seconds of the Captain America movie kind of indicating to audiences, okay, this is what he had been doing in the past. And then during this scene, which we've actually seen before at the end of Captain America, but just at a slightly different angle, gives you the idea of, okay, he's just been kind of finding his way now in the future.
And there also were several cut scenes that would have played around this point. They were basically him acclimating himself to the world. He goes to a cafe and there's a waitress there, which we see at the end of the movie. And there's a very heartbreaking scene where he's basically got the dossiers of all of the Howling Commandos. And each piece of paper he looks at is stamped with the giant word deceased. Until he gets to Peggy Carter, who is not deceased. But again, that's not in the movie itself.
Now, at this point in the movie, is he working for S.H.I.E.L.D.? I mean, obviously he's related to S.H.I.E.L.D., but is he still kind of an agent/soldier?
And that's a question I have as well. I don't know exactly. My guess is that because they found him and they thawed him out, he is kind of on their payroll. They're paying for him to live. They're paying for his apartment, I'm assuming. And because Nick Fury comes in and says what he says, and Steve asks him if he has a mission for him, I think he might be on their payroll. He might be working for them. But I also get the sense that this might be his first mission for them.
Let's take a second and talk about how smart Nick Fury is, because he's getting this team together to look for the Tesseract, but he's not just telling them the whole all-out story and getting what he wants. Instead, he's playing to each character's motivation. For Natasha Romanoff, he's having her go after Hawkeye after making a short stop in Calcutta, India. For Captain America, he entices him that this cosmic cube was used by Hydra, and thus he knows Captain America wants to get in to stop everything that's happening or could happen, that what Hydra did in his last movie. And then to entice Bruce Banner, he mentions to Natasha that it has gamma radiation, which she relays again to Bruce Banner and gets him into the game. And so Nick Fury has been manipulating in a positive way all these interactions to make sure he gets the outcome that he wants. And I think this is a great way to develop his character.
And that's a big part of his character in the comics. Nick Fury is a master manipulator. We also get some of that later on in this movie in maybe a less positive way, but I'm glad that they decided to integrate that with the film version.
The last superhero we get introduced to, well, not technically the last, but the last in the string of superhero scenes, is Tony Stark.
He's underwater, as you mentioned, jumping to from that last scene, and he's powering something up, and he goes out of the ocean, and he flies through New York. We're in New York here. We're not on the West Coast, and we learn that he has built a massive tower called Stark Tower that is being run by a bigger version of his arc reactor technology, and that it's actually clean energy and that it can run for up to a year or two. And in here, he says to Pepper, there's going to be another 2 buildings. So I'm curious at this point, are we going to get Stark Towers all over the country? I don't think that plays out in later scenes, but pretty much he goes and he flies onto the top, and we get a really cool shot of him having his armor taken off. In Iron Man 1, he had to have his armor taken off in that one spot. In Iron Man 2, he got the suitcase armor that could help him take on and off anywhere. In this movie, he's got this moving gimbal that as he's walking into his building, it just takes it off around him. And I remember this being something that was incredibly cool.
Yeah, this is a great shot. And he walks in and meets Pepper. Now, at this point, is Pepper still the CEO? Because the last we had seen her in Iron Man 2, she said she was going to quit.
I don't think that question is answered in this movie. There's a lot of people in this movie and a lot going on, and so there's not a lot of time for these side characters. In fact, Joss Whedon didn't have any side characters in this movie, and the only reason why Pepper Potts is in here is because Robert Downey Jr. demanded that Gwyneth Paltrow be in this film.
And I'm glad Robert Downey Jr. did, because I believe that builds a lot on her character, on his character, the character relationship just in general. And the scene not only has that add-on by Robert Downey Jr., but actually Kevin Feige himself changed something in this scene. It was Feige who wanted Stark to show up last. And so just like on my drinking cup, where Tony Stark is kind of the center figure of the Avengers, I believe Kevin Feige wanted Stark to show up last because he knew he was the most popular Avenger up to this point. We had already seen 2 movies of him. And I mean, Tony Stark is just awesome.
And again, he kicked off the Marvel Cinematic Universe in a big way. So that's definitely not surprising. One thing we learn here is Coulson comes into the scene and he drops a whole bunch of stuff off. And we find out that the Avengers Initiative was scrapped. Now, for me, this was actually really disappointing. There's been all this buildup to the Avengers Initiative, and that actually never, ever happens. The Avengers do end up forming, but not through the Initiative. And it was basically voted off because of the World Security Council. And we never found out what the real purpose of it was. Nick Fury has some lip service to the fact that it's to fight the battles that they never could, but there was a lot of speculation before this movie came out about why they needed the Avengers. What was the big event that Nick Fury was gathering the Avengers for? Was it aliens? Was it some impending doom that he knew about? And none of that happens here. And I'm also wondering at this point, where is Tony Stark in his relationship with S.H.I.E.L.D.?
Caleb, to answer your first question, for me, this works. I'm completely fine with it. Because if you look in the comics, how the Avengers were started was how this movie is progressing. They were a bunch of pre-made superheroes with their own comics, and it was, I believe, Rick Jones who pulled all of these heroes into one. And after that, they didn't necessarily stay as a team. They kind of split off and then decided to come together whenever there was a big threat, which happens in this movie. And so it fits in the comics. It fits what I knew about the Avengers, and it worked for me. As far as his relationship with S.H.I.E.L.D., well, he tries to play off Agent Coulson and does everything he can to get Agent Coulson to see him, so it's probably not the best.
Specifically, I'm wondering about the end of Iron Man 2. It's revealed that they want him as a consultant. Did that ever happen? I think it does, and I've never noticed this before, which happens a lot in this film because there's so much in it. He says that consulting hours are every other Thursday from, like 3 to 5 or something, and I thought that was just a joke. But I actually think that is his official consulting time for S.H.I.E.L.D. He is the consultant, as we saw in that one shot that we discussed a couple weeks ago. And that also would explain why Pepper Potts knows who Phil Coulson is and calls him Phil, which Tony Stark says, no, his first name's Agent.
Well, it's in this scene, too, and these interactions that you get the Tony that we fell in love with. He's snarky, he's jokey, he still can't be handed things, he's arrogant, and I don't know about you, Caleb, but after watching these movies in order, I appreciate Tony's character so much more than I did 10 years ago. He does just a fantastic job. Robert Downey Jr. does a fantastic job as Tony Stark, and Tony Stark's character in general is amazing, not only in this scene, but the rest of the movie.
You're exactly right, Zach. And so basically this scene ends with Coulson giving Tony a case of debriefing, and he opens it, and it's basically got a bunch of scenes from the previous movies, Captain America, Thor, and the Incredible Hulk, that he has to read up on to go and join S.H.I.E.L.D. with.
Now, I don't know if you caught this, but in one of the files on that Agent Coulson gives Tony Stark, there's something labeled Project 42. If you're familiar with the comics, Project 42 was what Tony Stark established as a prison for superheroes. So it took place kind of during the Civil War event when heroes were fighting heroes, and he establishes this prison off planet to house other superheroes that weren't registering for this act. So that was kind of a tiny Easter egg included in this scene that possibly could have pointed all the way into the future for Captain America 3.
So following this scene, we jump to the Quinjet. I don't think that this is ever mentioned by name in this film, but the Avengers in the comics for a long time have had this kind of jet that they call the Quinjet, and that's how they get around the world. In this film, they're basically just owned by S.H.I.E.L.D., and it's just one of many that they have. And on the Quinjet is Cap himself and Coulson.
That's right, and it's here that Coulson establishes himself as a fanboy.
We also learn that Captain America was the first superhero, And this is kind of news to me because in the Marvel Universe, there's a whole lot of time that hasn't been filled in. Here in 2018, we know that Captain Marvel existed in the 90s, which we didn't know for a long time. So I was curious if there had been superheroes before him. Apparently not. But there's also something in this scene that I think might be a retcon. Zach, do you know what I'm talking about?
Nope.
So when Coulson is talking to Steve, he says that he's basically explaining Banner. And he says that Banner thought gamma radiation could unlock the secret to Erskine's original formula for Captain America. Now, in The Incredible Hulk, we find out Banner didn't know what he was working on. Thunderbolt Ross hid it from him, and he thought he was working on something else. So I'm not sure if this is a retcon, if they just didn't realize what they were saying, or if Coulson's not informed. I would guess that Coulson is very well informed because he's part of S.H.I.E.L.D., and he always seems to know what's going on. But I wasn't sure how that worked.
I think it could be D, all of the above. I mean, they retconned so much of the material from 2008 while still making jokes kind of pertaining to that movie. So they keep some of it, they retcon some of it. Another retcon portion of that, as we had already mentioned, is how Bruce Banner is smart. And Agent Coulson backs this up again by stating how smart Bruce Banner is.
Also in this scene, we learn that Coulson helped design Steve's new suit.
After, we jump to Loki's hideout. And there's actually a couple scenes in Loki's hideout that are split between the hero scenes, but if we lump them all together, a couple things important happen. The first is that we get a lot more backstory on why Loki has turned into a murderous god.
Yeah, the staff can do this really cool, like, teleport mind projection thing, and he goes and he talks to the other that we saw at the beginning of the movie. And we learn that he gave him the staff so that Loki could invade Earth and bring the Tesseract back to the other. We also in this scene see some stairs that lead up somewhere, and we don't see exactly where it goes, but it's foreshadowing that the other is not the guy in charge here.
That's interesting you bring up the stairs, Caleb, because I can't recall their name right now, but it's either the writer or the artist who's responsible in the comics for writing a lot of the Infinity War and creating Thanos himself, actually created these steps. These steps are known for this writer / artist. And whenever you see these kind of style of steps, you know that this person is penciling and writing the comic. And this is kind of a callback to that person, not only as a foreshadow, but also because this person has been writing a lot of the Infinity War, which we obviously get later on.
Following on in a later scene that in Loki's hideout, we learn that they're after an element called iridium. Selvig has kind of been working on some kind of machine. We don't know exactly what it's going to do. We find out through the course of the movie, it's supposed to open a portal. Now, I don't know why they need this, except for some science babble talk that they need it for it to stay open. But if Loki can come in on a portal, you know what? I just answered my own question. Hey guys, this is podcasting at its best. I just answered my own question. The reason why they need this machine is because when Loki came in, it created all that buildup, and basically the entire place exploded. So they need this to stabilize it so that that doesn't happen. And Tony also says later, it will keep it open longer.
Well, that's right. And so it gives them the motivation on kind of where to go and what to do. This motivation that's been kind of missing from Loki, I believe, up to this point, because it's here when he is talking to the other that we identify Loki's motivation. He is basically charged with grabbing the Tesseract, and in exchange, he will get to rule Earth. So I think this is still tying back to his motivation we find in Thor. He's going to rule Earth. By that, he's going to make Odin happy, and in exchange, he gets the Tesseract to someone else. An interesting tidbit here, Caleb, is that he is told by the other, if you fail, he, and we don't know who he is at this point, will make you long for something sweet as pain. Now, spoiler alert, at the end of the movie, we get that reveal that he is Thanos. Now, Caleb, I believe that this is foreshadowing that in the Infinity War movie we will get in May, Loki is going to die. What are your thoughts?
That is a great and fairly obvious prediction that I have never thought about. I don't know. I mean, later in some other movies, Loki's just been hanging out and nothing's happened to him. So I don't know. But in the trailer that we've gotten for Infinity War, spoilers obviously, we see that Loki has the Tesseract, and it looks like he's giving it to Thanos or one of his minions. So I wouldn't be surprised if, Thanos kills him right there.
Think about it. He's stepping over the bodies of dead Asgardians. He finally presents the Tesseract, the Infinity Gem, to Thanos, who maybe congratulates him for 1 second and then simply kills him because he failed at his task. This would establish Thanos as a great character, which Kevin Feige has already said he establishes himself as the biggest Marvel villain to date. And number 2, I think that would be a great send-off for Loki. But that's just a prediction.
All right, guys, come back in like 5 months and ridicule Zach when he's wrong.
Hashtag Zach's wrong.
Again with the hashtags.
Caleb, we got no hashtag Tankgate. I was severely disappointed.
Well, I posted one.
We got one. So while all of this is happening at Loki's hideout, we also get some transitions to the helicarrier and what's happening with our heroes.
Yeah, so that Quinjet from earlier lands, and we get a lot of meetings. So Captain America meets Black Widow for the first time. He meets Bruce Banner for the first time. The whole team kind of meets each other. And for a while, Banner and Steve think that this whole thing is a submarine, which they couldn't be more wrong, because instead of going down, this thing goes up.
So this turns into an iconic comic book movie transport, which is the helicarrier, a aircraft carrier that can fly due to 4 turbines on kind of each side of it. Well, 2 on one side, 2 on the other. And not only that, but it also has some devices that allow it to cloak. Now, Caleb, watching this again, this is like a very comic book movie, well, comic booky thing to include in a movie. I was not surprised when I first saw this movie, but seeing it again, I'm very surprised that at that time they chose to include such a thing in a movie where they're trying to modernize all their superheroes. What are your thoughts on that?
I was very surprised when I saw this for the first time. I believe it was in one of the later trailers or TV spots for this movie before it came out, so we knew it was in here. But yeah, this thing took my breath away. It's the largest thing we've ever seen in a Marvel movie to date. The way that it lifts up is just cinematically beautiful. And it is kind of a ridiculous idea, but they make it work and they make it feel real in this scene. The other thing that I kind of want to talk about is we see when they land, there's a S.H.I.E.L.D. logo on the deck. This is a different S.H.I.E.L.D. logo than we had seen anywhere prior to this movie. When they started shooting this movie, they released, I believe it was the first picture of some chairs for all the cast members in front of this different S.H.I.E.L.D. logo. And everybody was wondering, why is there a different logo? It's inspired by the one that's in the Ultimate line of comics versus the traditional one, which is what they had been using previously. And there were some interviews about this, and basically what they said is that the helicarrier is their base, right? And so it should have something special. And so they redesigned the logo. It's very much more angular. I like it a lot, Zach. I don't know if you remember this changing, but this is the logo that they end up using throughout the rest of the MCU movies.
If you're listening to this, wondering why we just spent 2 minutes talking about a simple logo, look at the title of our podcast.
'Cause we're nerds.
We also get a brief glimpse of Agent Sitwell.
Yeah, we talked about him in Thor. That was his first appearance. Then we talked about him again in that one shot. And here he is again. And like I said, this is something that Marvel's really good about, is sprinkling these characters in, so that when they matter, you already feel attached to them.
Captain America, unfortunately, also loses a bet and has to give $10 to Nick Fury. Side note.
Which is a callback to an earlier scene where he said nothing would surprise him anymore.
And it does. Surprised Caleb as well. And they also, in this scene, are able to find Loki being able to track that idea that Caleb talked about, where the Tesseract needs the iridium to stabilize. And off to Stuttgart, Germany, they go. And it's here we see more of Loki as an antagonist. And again, I don't know, this just doesn't fit Loki's character for me, because I haven't seen him strictly as this evil antagonist. I don't think we see him like this in any of the other Thor movies, Thor 1, 2, or 3, but we get him like this in the Avengers movie. And so, yeah, I guess it works for this movie if you just assume it's a standalone. But if you look at all the movies, it doesn't, because it's here where he takes a device and stabs a man in the eye with it. And this painful machine twirls around his eye as it reads it. Like, it's such an evil and nasty thing to do.
I was wondering if this, like, cuts his eye out, if he's still able to see afterwards, or if it just completely screws his face up. I don't think it matters so much as the cringiness of what he's doing.
Exactly. And it's here we actually get a lot of the costume reveals. So we see Loki and his costume, which I'm pretty sure is the same as we saw in Thor. Maybe a few tweaks here or there, but any different?
I remember this costume being different, but watching it this time and following from Thor, it is mostly the same. He's got some different armor, and he actually has 2 different costumes in this movie, I noticed. He's got basically his regular undercoat, his overcoat, and then for most of the movie, he's got this metal, I forgot what it's called, but like a shoulder plate, right? That's got a band, a leather band that comes down. Later in the movie, he's actually got one of those on each shoulder. So his costume does vary. The biggest difference is his helmet. If you take his helmet and you turn it sideways, the profile is fairly different. In the Thor movie, the horns kind of went straight up and looped. In this one, the horns go out in front much more. And of course, all of his clothes have been weathered because he hasn't been home to get new ones.
It's a sick looking costume, in my opinion.
Dude, that helmet's the best.
Oh, it's so cool. Iron Man's suit of armor is also pretty much the same. Whose costume changes is Captain America's. And I have to say, Caleb, I despise this costume.
I know a lot of people have issues with this, and maybe I'm just more forgiving than most people about a lot of things, but I didn't have that big of an issue with this at the time. I still don't have that big of an issue with it. It doesn't look as good as his other costumes. I am totally down for that. But for their first go at a modern Captain America costume, it's way better than those direct-to-DVD 90s movies.
True, but it just is sort of cringy. It looks like a comic book movie costume. And Caleb, at this point, I would probably rather have the costume he's wearing when he's selling war bonds than the costume he has now.
And this is one thing that's interesting with every movie. I'm not sure if they still do it. Marvel puts out these art of books, right? Where it's got a lot of the concept art. And they went through a lot of variations. And there's actually photos of Chris Evans in this costume with his ears out. And the reason that matters is because in the comics, Captain America's helmet, his ears pop out the side, right? And it allows him to hear, and it just gives a different profile. In this movie, they opted to cover them up, which is an interesting difference, but I actually think the ones where his ears were out of the helmet look better.
Now, in this scene, Captain America takes down Loki. Well, he tries to take down Loki until finally Iron Man arrives, and this is the first meeting between Iron Man and Captain America. Not a lot of words are shared, but it's pretty sweet.
It's very Tony Stark inspired, and you did mention it's pretty much the same costume. It's because it is. It's the Mark VI.
Now, Caleb, I love the meeting between Iron Man and Captain America, and I think it's one of the strongest relationships in this movie. But I think this scene doesn't do a whole lot for Captain America, and I think it sets a precedent in this entire movie that shows Captain America is weak. If you look at this scene, he is getting thrashed by Loki. He holds some of his own, but even Natasha Romanoff states they're everywhere, right? And it's actually closer to the end of the battle where it looks like Captain America is going to lose against Loki until Iron Man comes in and saves the day. And it's only until Iron Man comes in that Loki decides to give up.
Well, I'd never read it as Captain America not being able to win. I just read it as them, fighting all over the place and not being able to get a good lock on them. But when Iron Man comes in, regardless of the situation of the fight, and you point all those guns at me, I'm going to stop. I'm surprised that Loki stops for the sheer fact that he seemed to not care earlier in the film when he arrived on Earth. But as we will see, this actually plays into his plan. And there's actually a deleted scene earlier in the film that took place in his hideout where he's speaking with Hawkeye. And Hawkeye says, yeah, maybe it is a good idea to be seen. Because while they came here to get that iridium that they need, Loki goes outside, which he didn't have to do, in order to draw in the Avengers.
So they take Loki back to a helicarrier on the Quinjet, Tony being his typical Tony self and making a joke about Captain America as a capsicle. But it's in this kind of brief exchange before Thor arrives that we get the first hint that Nick Fury isn't exactly telling all the Avengers the truth. In fact, Tony Stark states a lot of things Nick Fury doesn't tell you. Or, excuse me, there is a lot of things that Nick Fury doesn't tell you.
And then there's a lightning strike, some thunder, and Thor flies into the Quinjet, grabs Loki, and flies off. And this is, I think, one of the few plot holes I have with this film. Why doesn't Tony know who Thor is? So when Coulson comes and leaves that package at his house, and all those holograms come up in the Stark Tower, Thor is definitely one of the things on those screens. He had a debriefing about him. And when this happens, Cap says, "Who was that?" And Tony says, "I don't know." Why doesn't he know? Like, if he read an entire thing about him that Coulson probably wrote because he was the guy there, why doesn't he know who he is? And why does he go and fight him?
That is a good point that I actually had never thought of. I have no answer for you. All I know is that there's only one God, ma'am, and he doesn't dress like that.
In a very Captain America-esque line as he grabs a chute and jumps out the back of the plane, which is a callback to some very famous panels from some Ultimate comic books.
And Caleb, you also answered my question I have. How is Thor back on Earth? When Thor grabs Loki and they're on the mountainside for the brief moment, Loki does kind of answer that question by stating, "And how much dark energy did Odin have to use to transport you here?" So Odin is obviously very powerful and able to use other methods to transport gods across the Nine Realms instead of using the now destroyed Bifrost.
And in that vein, this is the first movie that starts to do this thing that I have an issue with, that a lot of Marvel films do. There'll be a great film, it'll end on some major changing event, and then in the next film, it's completely ignored or it's thrown to the side. They do it here with the Bifrost. It happens again in Thor 2 with the Bifrost. It happens in Avengers 2 with some things. And it's one of my bigger complaints about stuff that Marvel does.
We also get an Easter egg here, only for a brief moment, as when Thor slams Loki to the ground, two crows in the background are seen flying off and away.
And as some of you will know, crows represent Odin, not only in the comic books, but also in traditional Norse mythology. I believe that they represent his all-seeing eyes, and anything that they see in Norse mythology, he sees as well.
These two crows in Norse mythology are Hugin and Munnin, and it is said that they fly around, that they gather information, and they go back to Odin and report everything they've seen. Also, the reason that Odin has one eye is that he sacrificed it for wisdom, which I just wanted to mention that we incorrectly stated back in our Thor podcast that he could possibly see everything. He actually can't. He sacrificed his eye for wisdom, and the crows see everything in traditional Norse mythology. So that still doesn't solve all the issues we had back in Thor, but I digress. This is the Avengers.
When you said those crows' names and you said hugging, I definitely imagined two crows like hugging each other.
Again, it's a Norse name, so I probably mispronounced it. But hey, I don't speak Norse. I don't speak Russian. Give me a break.
So in this exchange with Loki and Thor, we find out that basically Thor and Odin and everyone thought Loki was dead. They mourned for him, and Thor wants him to come home. Of course, he refuses. And in flies Iron Man to take down Thor because he's sad that Thor stole his stuff.
Now, one character shift they do in this movie that I think works for Thor is that he has more of a Shakespearean dialogue that he uses. We talked about in the Thor podcast that his wording is a lot more modernized, but I feel that in this Avengers movie, they actually shift it more towards a Shakespearean style of talking, or at least in this first scene. And we even get a call out from Iron Man where they land and he's like, "What is this? Shakespeare in the Park?"
Yeah, and I think they can do that here because he's not speaking the whole movie. If he were, that would get annoying, but he doesn't. And so they're able to sprinkle it in more here, and it feels natural because we don't hear from him as much and because he is from another planet.
And it's during the scene, Caleb, that, I mean, it's a pretty cool scene. I love this scene between Thor, Iron Man, and then in the briefest of moments, Captain America. But I have two why questions. Why, number one, when Iron Man takes out Thor, why didn't Loki run away? He just stayed.
That is a very common complaint about this movie, and it goes back to this movie being stuffed with information. If you really trace what happens through this movie, as we'll find out in the next couple scenes, Loki wants to be captured. He has a reason why he went outside in Germany. He has a reason why he lost to Captain America and Iron Man. He has a reason why he stays here and sits, and it's so that he can end up back in the helicarrier. Now, one of my questions is, in this fight, Thor electrocutes Iron Man, right? And instead of it actually hurting his armor too much, he basically gets a 400% charge. Why doesn't the same thing happen in Iron Man 2 when Whiplash is attacking him?
Well, that's not my second why, but that is a great why question. No idea. Maybe the technology is a little different, but I mean, it uses electricity, but perhaps it's from an arc reactor versus nature.
Interesting point.
My second why is, why did they all stop when Captain America showed up, right? So you have Thor and Iron Man battling, Captain America shows up, Thor goes after Captain America, hits his shield, and then after that explosion, they all get up and they just stop. Thor has presented himself as he's the brother of Loki. He just wants to take Loki home. He doesn't want to deal with anybody else. And yet, after fighting these two, he still obviously has some strength left and just decides to chill.
Well, I was surprised that he actually attacked Captain America when he came down, because he seemed fairly calm. And then all of a sudden, he comes in and brings the hammer down, as they say. So I think maybe after the blast, he realizes that they're fairly evenly matched. This isn't going to go anywhere. And maybe his anger has calmed a bit. So they stand there and presumably speak for a moment. And then maybe Coulson calls down and is like, "Hey, guy, remember me?" I don't know. But you're right, it is a little bit strange.
You said evenly matched. I would have to disagree with you here. I think Thor is incredibly powerful. I think it shows Iron Man is incredibly powerful. Captain America throws his shield, and then Thor goes after him, and he tucks up into a ball so he doesn't get killed, right? And then they stop fighting. If they were to continue to fight, I think Captain America would be severely undermatched in how they represent his character in this movie. Again, for me in this scene, Captain America feels very underpowered compared to Iron Man and Thor.
Well, when I said that, I didn't mean like his power level was strong, because you're right. Thor is definitely stronger than him. But if his hammer isn't going to do anything against that shield, up until this point, all of Thor's power is coming from that hammer. Without the hammer, he doesn't have much. He's durable and he's strong. We see him crushing Iron Man's gauntlets. But I think that Captain America is also skilled enough that he would have been able to hold his own. Ultimately, they do all end up on the same side, and they take Loki onto the helicarrier, where they put him in a cage. But on his way there, he sees Banner working in the lab, and gives him a smile.
That's right. And it's in this transition that like the next 30 minutes all take place on this helicarrier. So it's been pretty smooth up to this point. And then we just take a long stretch of time in the helicarrier, a few scenes here or there, and a long stretch of time in New York. So this movie transitions, like we've stated earlier in the podcast, very well.
And this is also where Iron Man kind of joins up with the rest of the team, and the entire team comes together under one roof. And so we jump to the bridge of the helicarrier, and we get some reveals here. We as an audience know that Loki has an army that he's going to bring to Earth. The Avengers at this point do not. And so Thor tells him that he has a Chitauri army that he's going to bring to Earth and try to invade with. We also find out from Tony that Loki needs a whole bunch of ingredients in order to make his portal work. And my question here is, how does Tony know exactly what Loki needs? They know about the iridium because that's what he stole in Germany. But aside from that, he should have no idea what else this magical cube needs to open up a portal.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't really have an answer for you.
There's another line in this scene when Tony walks in that's really funny. He makes an offhand comment about that guy is playing Galaga, right? And we see it later, the guy is playing Galaga. That line was actually improvised by Tony, by Robert Downey Jr. on the day.
That's right, and not only does he have that line, but he also has the one-liner where he walks up to Thor and says, "No hard feelings, Point Break, you got a mean swing," which comes into play in Thor 3. And when I watched Thor Ragnarok, I'm like, wait, he actually does say that? And going back to this movie, I guess I didn't really remember that line, but in that line's a callback to the Point Break movie. Have you ever seen that movie?
I have, the original one. There's actually a remake now, which I doubt is as good,
Ooh.
but that original one is very good.
Okay, well, you know it better than I since I haven't seen it, so I had to Google it. But in this 90s movie, it has Keanu Reeves and Patrick Swayze. And Patrick Swayze looks like the Thor in this movie. And so that's what Tony Stark is indicating kind of with that comment.
That's right. And I think a lot of that has to go back to that hair that Thor's decided to grow out since his own movie.
I think this also establishes another smart person in this room. We know that Tony Stark is incredibly smart. We have been getting hints that Bruce Banner is incredibly smart, and they have a quick dialogue that indicates they are both extremely smart, and they are the ones that are searching to locate where Loki is. Also, side note, Bruce Banner is wearing a purple shirt.
And he does for a lot of this movie from this point on. So it's also in the helicarrier that we get a whole bunch of different interactions between the characters. These are kind of interspersed with some other scenes. But we get Tony Stark and Steve Rogers talking.
Well, Caleb, they're not necessarily talking as much as bickering. It's on the helicarrier that they continue to develop a lot of these Avengers, and it's through interactions. And I think these two characters in general have the best relationship in this Avengers movie. Tony Stark is arrogant. He's snarky. He's kind of this lone ranger. On the other hand, you have Steve Rogers, who's a soldier. He follows orders. He gives, he gives some direction, but he is part of a team. And so you have these two kind of counter opposite characteristics that butt heads. And it's very true to comics. And I think it works very well in this movie. What did you think about the relationship?
I think you hit it right on the head. I think that they do kind of butt heads. And I think that unintentionally, this really sets the stage for Captain America Civil War. Now, apart from those two, we also get Stark and Bruce talking. And these two are called the Science Bros to the fan community. And they're in the lab, and Stark is poking Bruce, and they're talking, but really they're analyzing Loki's staff, right? And Tony is also trying to convince Bruce that his gamma radiation, it might be a curse, but he can turn it into a gift. He can use it for good. He can use it to better himself. And this is one of the rare occasions that I think that Tony is very heartwarming and not just jokey. and that what he's saying really rings true and could be very good advice.
Not only the Hulk and this gamma radiation a gift, but the fact that the Hulk saved his life. That Bruce Banner would have died, but it was the Hulk through the radiation that actually kept Bruce Banner alive. Very interesting point.
Also, through some different scenes with those two and Steve Rogers, we find that Steve becomes a little bit distrusting of S.H.I.E.L.D., and he goes snooping around, and he finds some Hydra weapons, which ties back to a conversation that Stark and Bruce have about Phase 2. And we don't know what that is at this point, but we find out a little bit later that it's something Fury has been hiding from them.
Now, does this have any connection to Phase 2 in the MCU?
That was my first thought watching this time and in past viewings, and I don't think so. I'm not really sure what this is a reference to. I feel like it has to be a reference to something, but that's the only thing I could think of is the Phase 2 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Yeah, I Googled this because I wanted a hot scoop for our podcast. Found nothing. Very disappointed. What I will mention is that during these interactions and kind of during a lot of the scene, Tony Stark, and for the majority of the movie, he is wearing a Black Sabbath t-shirt. Unfortunately, Caleb, we failed in our first podcast as we stated that the song Iron Man was from AC/DC. It is.
I think that you mean you failed.
Okay.
That.
I think it's you. Come on, man. We swim together, we die together. And as you listeners might well know, it's actually a song from Black Sabbath. So I think it's a call to that. So to that one listener that pointed it out, thanks for emailing us. If you ever catch anything, feel free to email us because we're nerds. However, when Iron Man appeared in this movie, they were playing Shoot to Thrill, which is an AC/DC song. Hashtag, I did not Google that.
So following on from this, we also get a short scene of Thor talking to Coulson and talking to Fury, and we get basically a throwaway line that says they've moved Jane Foster to a safe facility, basically so they don't have to pay her to be in this film.
Another scene that we get between two people is when Black Widow decides to go and start interrogating Loki. Now, Loki thinks he has the Black Widow on the run. Natasha Romanoff is amazing and is able to flip that and basically interrogate Loki while he believes he's interrogating her. Great job. However, it's here that we learn, A, that Natasha is a double agent and that she almost died, but Clint Barton, Hawkeye, saved her. And B, that she has red in her ledger, and Loki lists off a couple examples. Now, Caleb, I'm going to start with the second one. I didn't really connect with any of this storyline, or to be honest, really get a lot of it. Why does she have red in her ledger, and why does it matter if it's in the past and she's already changed?
Well, for people that know the comic books, Black Widow has not always been a good guy, and she alludes to that in this film. She was a bad person, and Clint was actually the one that came to kill her, right? And he made a different call. And so I think she's referring to everything she did prior to S.H.I.E.L.D. She probably killed a lot of people. She probably hurt a lot of people. And even though she's on the good side now, it doesn't erase what she did. She feels that she needs to do something big enough that's good to wipe out all of the bad that she's done. And to me, that's what the red in her ledger is.
And the three things that Loki mentions, I believe, is Sao Paulo's one of them. Another is Dracov's daughter, and I can't remember the third one off the top of my head. However, I Googled all of these, and they don't appear in the comics at all or in any of the later movies. So I'm hoping with the announcement that we will be receiving a Black Widow solo movie, some of this material will be covered.
I bet that some of it will at least be mentioned, if not seen. Another line in this scene, she says love is for children. Do you think she's being serious here, or is she just trying to play Loki?
I think she's just trying to play Loki.
Okay, that's what I was wondering, because we see in Avengers 2, love isn't so much for children.
Caleb, that reminds me that there's a pretty raunchy meme that went around after this Avengers movie with the Hulk smiling, and I'm just going to leave it at that.
Oh, goodness. So also around this time, we see that Hawkeye is flying in on a jet, and he's readying some bombs, but they don't go off quite yet. As we jump back into the lab that Banner and Stark are talking in, as all the other Avengers start to file in.
Thanks for listening to 'Cause We're Nerds, Road to Marvel's Infinity War, The Avengers, Part 1. You can find the rest of this podcast in Part 2, The Avengers. Stay nerdy.